Coins. The crowd rotates by chemical signals fired into synaptic gaps, zeros and ones shot into space, downloaded onto screens, reassembled into words instructing Parisians to gather at République by 6, and they do in the thousands, and begin their waltz around the draped statue that shows how good ideas must be held aloft, abstracted, like 12 lives turned to martyr's treasure, one side of a coin depicting decadence and insult, the other, tendered here, brave insouciance before backward ideals. A cannon puff announces their transcendence from lives into paper lanterns, rising from the hands of figures in black who've mounted the plinth like security agents of justice. Glowing white orbs drift upward through the silvery drizzle, and thousands cheer as one, unified tonight, as somewhere else thousands are too, in agreement that a life is not just a life, but a vessel for the value we assign it.
That was poet, author and editor John Freeman reading the poem Coins from the collection Maps. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
The poem Coins hints at the city we're in, Paris, and perhaps the sort of civil gatherings we've been seeing a lot in recent years. Can you tell us more about how you wrote that?
Yeah, I wrote that in 2015, the night of the Hebdo attacks. I teach here in Paris for NYU and heard the sirens in the middle of my 11 a.m. class and didn't know what was happening. And then, like the rest of people who live here, spent the rest of the day in shock and horror and outrage and grief. And that night there was a gathering at République, and I, without knowing how I found out about it, was there and was watching what felt like an exchange of lives to something else. That they were no longer people, but sort of meaningful coins in a system of exchange between East and West, between violence and peace. And I went home and wrote that poem in a state of grief and fury.
Indeed. Now that collection of poems, Maps, is something quite transportative, let's say. It transports the reader from Paris to New York, London, Beirut. Can you tell us a bit more about the personal side of that journey? What inspired this poetry?
Yeah, my mother died in 2010, and one of the things she left me was this sense that sometimes life is defined by what's missing from it. And around that time, I began to travel quite a bit for work. I was the editor of a magazine called Granta, and so I was traveling here, there, and everywhere to promote the magazine and foreign editions of it. And every city I went to, I suddenly saw it through what was possibly missing. Sometimes it was people, sometimes it was aspects of history, sometimes it was the voices of people not heard. And I began to write poems around those lacunae. And it was the last gift my mother gave me, was that way of seeing.
Indeed. Well, that collection, Maps, was published just over a year ago, and since then poetry sales have been on the rise when it comes to poetry books. Some say that success is in part thanks to spoken word nights and festivals, which are bringing more readers to live events. Here in Paris, poetry is on the menu once a month at the Shakespeare and Company bookshop. The brainchild of bookseller Sarah Moore, the readings have attracted some renowned poets, and she told me why poetry needs to be experienced off the page and about the unique challenge of translating verse.
Often we're just reading in our head on a page, and poetry is really made to be read aloud. So to memorize it, suddenly the sound brings the poem to life. For poetry, I don't think it can be translated word for word at all. I think it needs to be rewritten in the new language. Often, looking at a translation can make me discover even more meaning in an original, because it's a way of demonstrating what language can do. In one language, what are its limits in another. It's like a game.
Well, Sarah mentions translation there, and I wanted to ask you about the translation of the title of your book, the geographical nature of it. In English, it's called Maps, which suggests a kind of journey or a quest, and in French, it translates as You Are Here, which refers to maybe a destination. How do you feel about that translation?
Well, I love it because it was one of the original titles of the book. If you go to a map today, the first thing it shows you is a little pin that says You Are Here. And as I was telling you before, the book is in some ways written through the aperture of grief. And so one of the things I found strange about traveling the world is not just that I was wherever I went and I was reinterpreted through my exchanges with foreigners and people not like me, but the person I was missing was also with me. And my mother was a great big reader and loved reading about the world and politics and history and poetry, but she never got to travel. And so one of the emotional resonances of that title for me is just the way that we carry the missing with us wherever we go.
And you chose that very bookshop, Shakespeare and Company, for the launch of the latest edition of your literary anthology, the biannual literary anthology Freeman's. And this one features French authors Leila Slimani and Edouard Louis, among other writers. Now, the theme this time is power. What did you want to find out about power through the work of these authors?
Well, I think that power is something that is negotiated constantly, whether you're on the street, walking, choosing whether or not to move if you're a woman and a man is walking towards you, or if in Leila Slimani's case, it's the lives of Moroccan women discussing intimacy between themselves in spaces which are not accessible to men. So I think power is often thought of in our current lives as something that is about dominance and to some degree about abuse, partly because the spectacular nature of those abuses dominates our news cycle. And in real life, we exercise power all the time. And power can be the ability to be generous. It could be the capacity for love. It can be a way of caring for others. And those things are powerful too. And if we redefine power through our stories, I think we make it harder to be dominated.
Well, the idea of power actually made me think of the power of an editor or a publisher. And you mentioned you worked at Granta and as well as Freeman's. You have the power to push certain voices to the fore, even launch careers. What are the sort of voices you want to be championing right now? What voices should we be hearing?
As an editor, I try not to think a lot about who a writer is and what they are. What I most want is a writer saying something that only they can say. And in order to do that, I need to read widely and to listen carefully to voices that are saying something that maybe is running against the ways of reality. And I think in contemporary life, we tend to compartmentalize writers who are of color, women writers, queer writers, and we ask them to perform their identity for us. And so as an editor, I try to just simply look for what is most urgently being told in ways that only a writer can say it.
And in 2014, going back to previous work of yours, you put together a collection of essays and short stories, even a poem focusing on New York, where you live, but specifically economic inequality in New York. Some of the very famous contributors in there put in work, Zadie Smith, Dave Eggers, Jonathan Safran Foer, and also your brother Tim, who wrote an essay called Home. He had a very, very different experience of the city to you. Can you explain how? Yeah,
I put that book together in part because I was living in London. I returned to New York, and I was just appalled by the nature of the city and how so many people were homeless. And in order to function ethically there as a person, you had to look away, because if you engaged with it, you had to do something. I personally would walk down the street and pass 2, 3, 4 homeless people before I got to the corner. And my brother was one of those people. He wasn't on the street for the whole time. He eventually wound up in a shelter. And so I decided as an editor it was time to put together a series of essays and stories and poems about what it felt like to live in New York City in this moment of peak inequality, where the rich were earning around $700,000 a year, and a great percentage of the city was poor or in shelters. And Tim, I wrote about this. I wrote about Tim in my introduction, and when I showed it to him, he said, "Please don't publish that." And I said, "Well, what if you wrote your own story about what it was like to be homeless and to live in shelters?" And he did, and it was the most important commission I ever made.
And in that introduction that you mentioned, you described the wealth gap with some eye-watering statistics, a massive gulf between the top 1% and the lowest 10% of earners in New York. How do you think this situation in the city is affecting creativity or the arts?
People are leaving. I mean, urban life is already stressful and difficult, but it's even more so if you can't have a home. And one of the things that comes up consistently in that collection is how hard it is to live in New York, to pay rent, to just do basic things. And so a lot of writers and artists are leaving the city. They're not just going to the outer boroughs, they're leaving New York entirely. They're going elsewhere. That's a dangerous thing because our cities are where powerful things happen, where decisions are made. They have to be watched. The dream life of those places has to be narrated. And I think right now it's a critical time because we're living in the United States in a second Gilded Age where the catastrophic gap between the everyday people and the astronomically rich is beyond imagination. And in order to live in that time, this time, we have to see it. And we need writers there to witness it.
Indeed. Now, we've asked you, as a writer, for a cultural tip, and you've pointed us in the direction of images, not words, a collection of Brassai's photographs, which are on show in San Francisco at the moment. Why should we be checking that out?
Well, Brassai had ability to capture this sort of elemental mist of Paris. Those photographs from the 1930s, which this collection draws from heavily, it's like he understood the way that Paris is a city of smoke and stone. He's also someone from outside of France, and there's the loneliness of the outsider, too, in those images.
John Freeman, thank you so much for coming in today. The Poetry Collection Maps is available in English and in French under the title Vous, êtes, ici, and we'll leave you with a selection of Brassai's photos from that exhibition in San Francisco. Do remember to check out our website, and you can also keep up with Encore on social media too. There's more news coming up on France 24 just after this.